All right, so in the last video we were setting up a collision system. Now we need to be able to test it. So we don't need to get crazy because we just got to make sure that we can make it. But we know that our custom properties, we had a spawn and we had a player. So we could go ahead and just copy this. And keep in mind that the shape that this ultimately gets does not need to be this, because the player ends up being created as circle or whatever shape we want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and copy. And all this is really doing is just giving me the information that I need to create something else. So this one, let's go ahead and change it to enemy. Okay, and that's done. So now we have an enemy. Now make sure you're selecting the spawn layer because that's what's going to get built. So now we have our player, we have our enemy. We can go ahead and do another one, and let's make this a coin. So we're spawning a coin. Okay, now we can save this. This is my test map. Okay, so now I have a player, I have a coin, and I have an enemy. We could go ahead and try running what we got right now, see if there are any issues. And then we can start dealing with that. So we're debugging a lot of lines to check for this. That's taken forever to build. All right. That's right. Okay. So we weren't able to test collisions because right now the way that we're building our player and spawning the map is a little bit different. So let's double check how we are doing our controls. Our controls are being done if the entity has a player component. I should create the player, and then we're dealing with movement from the body. When we are creating our entity manager, we're spawning based off the layer. And our main game screen on the show method. Okay, so we made some changes on here from the last one. We're setting our map to that. Let's see. Updating our camera. Okay. So we want to build an update method. Let's call it this because this is going to be for dealing with our camera. So our camera right now, we want it to be able to follow the player. So let's do private void. I'm going to call it update camera, and we don't really need anything. So inside our update camera, we're going to have to be able to have it linked to the player, but we're not going to have a hold on the player in here. Let me double check. There's my player, but we're not actually initializing. So that's what we changed. Okay, so because we're not initializing with the player, let me go into collision system, and we're going to try to build this smartly, like what I was saying. So we're not going to create a player, and we're just going to have to check if that entity. Okay, so if it's the player, we know it's the player. That means in our main game screen, we're not going to have a handle of the player, but we should be able to in our update camera, position dot set. All right, actually, before I do that, I'm going to get the entity. So I'm going to get that player entity. So I'm just going to call entity player is equal to let me see, engine dot get entities. I'll do it here. Family dot all dot player component. Since we only have one, player component dot class dot get what's it not like? Let me think. All right, so getting the camera for the player without actually using a handle, I'm just pulling the player component, but all the entities that have a player component class, and since we only have one, I'm using an enhanced for loop. That means that we could do camera dot position dot set, and then pull that player position. So I could do so let's go ahead and just from that player I could do let's do body component, body equals player. Now we have that player dot get component, and then we want the body that belongs to that player, so player component class, and now we could get the body. Yeah. Okay, so then for in our camera position, we can say, because we're in the body component, actually let me write that, body component. So we're in the body component now, so we can say body component dot get body dot get position. That's going to be our X and Y, and now we need nothing for a 0. So that would update our camera for right now. So when we want our player to be where the camera is focused, that's what we can do. And then we need to update our camera, so camera dot update. And now instead of doing it here, we are actually just abstracting out, so we're going to update the camera. This would allow us to be able to pull other different camera methods if we don't want to always following the player, and to maybe stay towards the middle of the screen. If we needed to, we could start doing that, or lock it into the middle of the screen, and then at other times follow the player. So that should deal with that. Let's see where we're at. Because we're going to have movement back on the player. All right, we got movement, but it's not really what we want. Okay. So let's go back to our entity manager. So before, when we knew everything was working, we were spawning the entity, we were passing that it was a player, and we were pulling 8 and 5. Now we are pulling that entity, so we need to make sure in our entity manager, when we're just spawning the maps, that we're correctly pulling all that stuff and plugging it in. Okay. So when we're spawning our entities, that's our map layer, pulling the objects from it, and then we're spawning, so based off the player. So instead of us spawning the entity and we're passing in that X and Y, we're doing that through tiled map. And we already know that this stuff was working. Now we need to look at being able to get that movement again. And that camera, let's see, where are we doing with our render? Setting the update for our camera. We're doing our physics system is doing our steps. And we're getting that body position and updating the body positions. Moving it right, up, down, or left. If none of those are touched, we'll make it idle. Okay. Main game screen. Okay. So we did notice that when we were doing the map, that map disappeared. We might be off the screen somewhere, which means that maybe it's not pulling the right position from the camera. So this update camera is pulling from that body. We want to be able that we can move the body where we're wanting. Let's just run it again. Okay. We are moving, but we don't see in reference to how well we are moving because we don't see any of our entities or the map. Okay, so this looks like if I don't push anything and it's going to go through, and now it's inactive. So we are moving. So that means that that camera, where it's putting our player, because before the camera was getting set to the viewport for our map. So when we were doing our map, it was showing us. So we know that that's getting built. What I think's happening is there's a conversion issue. We have our game viewport, which is taking the virtual width and virtual height, and our camera. And we're setting our initial virtual width and virtual height. We're setting the camera to be centered on there. But now when it's creating our player, it is not creating our player where we want it to be. So there is some issues with that. Now, when we did our original, so let's just see. When we undo this update camera right here, and we are pulling from the camera update, we are getting stuff scaled in the right position where our bottom left corner of our screen is down in the bottom left corner instead of being positioned somewhere else. So if I run this without that update camera method on there, and that map shows up, then what that's telling me, because we are correctly mapping, what that's telling me is that somewhere, probably around over here, our player is actually being created, or there's a scaling issue. So we need to make sure that our player is being created in the correct spot. So let's go to our entity manager and double check where that's being created. So that's pulling that int x and that int y from our layers object of our map. So if we went back into our Android assets and we loaded up that test map, that is the map that we're loading, right? Then we should be able to look at that TMX data and start trying to read out where our stuff is. Okay. So we're looking for the spawn layer. So here's our spawn layer. There's our player value. We are looking at 149.5 and 392. So we need to see if it's pulling that right information out. And we also have spawning for enemy, and here's our X and our Y. So that's the lowercase x and y, and then we have for our coin, which does not have the x and y. Let's double check. That did not pull all the stuff. So 149.5, 392.0, 149.5, 392.0, 178, and 417.75. That was my enemy. Okay. Oh, all right. I'm reading this differently. 215.75 is the player. So let's double check that. 215.75 and 408.25. So I'm in debug mode right now. And that special property is the player. So when we're pulling that, we're getting the X and Y value. So we need to make sure that we are getting the correct X and Y for our world. When we're going in the entity manager, let's go ahead for every entity that it's creating. We want to capture that. So for the player, we know that the X is getting passed in. Let's gdx.app.log and we are going to say player creation, and we want to find out the position where it's at. Position is at plus x, lowercase x, man, I cannot type today, comma, put a space between each one, and y, and no, plus. Okay, so that will give us the player creation, because that's where we're ultimately putting our camera, and we want to make sure that so our enemies and all that stuff, we want them generated in the right spot. So there might be a conversion issue that we did forget to do for when we're creating the entities, but we did have them correctly when we were doing the level collision generator. So we're going to look at both of those pieces. Okay, so we got it created. Let's start looking through the data. Unrecognized map shape, ellipsis, player creation at 2:15 and 2:31. And we needed the player to be at really, in terms of the world, we want that player to be at like 13 and 25. But going the other way. So from bottom left corner, that's where we want it to be drawing. So actually it might be drawing way to the left because it's in terms of a different size for our units. So if we look at our level collision generator, what it's doing when we are pulling that information, we had to scale some on the size. So when we pulled that shapes, we had to divide by a ppm to keep everything in terms of the unit. So when it was originally created, we wanted to deal with it in terms of one, in terms of our scale. So we divided everything. So we did not do that in our entity manager when we started doing it. So let's look at our entity manager when we actually go to our body component, which is dealing with their size. We're using that generator create body. Let's go to the generator. No, give me the generator. Body generator. Okay. So here we are not converting down. So that means that our size is way off. That X and Y value should be a lot lower. So using our level collision generator as a reference, when we were building with a rectangle, we divided the x plus the width divided by ppm, the y plus the height divided by ppm, and then we set the box based on that and the size. We did the same thing for doing circles and our ellipse. We divided by the shape. So let's go ahead and look at our entity manager, or not our entity manager, our body generator. Let's quickly look at that. So setting the radius, we needed the dimensions, but then we needed to divide by 2. ppm. Okay. We have this whole thing that is going to get divided by our figures.ppm. Our whole position is going to be divided by figures.ppm. Okay. And then if they had a different shape, so here we're setting as box. Let's double check that we set that the same as the level collision generator. We're doing the width divided by the height divided by, and then we're passing in the size. Okay. So here we set it differently. Well, that's kind of dumb. Okay, so we're setting as box that's the full dimension. So let's divide that whole thing, converting it to the figures.ppm, and then the y divided by figures.ppm. And then when we're setting the position, this is we're going the position of x where it's starting at plus half the dimension. That needs to also be converted to our size for our game world. Same for here. So once we do that, we really shouldn't have to refer to our ppm pixels per meter, and we can stay in our game world sizes. So that's really the only area where we're doing the conversion, the same as we had to do the level collision generator. So let's go ahead and run it again, see if that did it, because we should be starting in our world with our player. All right. Okay. So now let's go ahead and stop that. Well, can we move around? I'm seeing the world, but not us above it. So there's actually a rendering order that we're going to have to deal with. But let's go up. Now we know that it's scaling it to where we created it. So that's the player creation. That was the X and Y. But when it actually got into the body generator, then it did it more like what we wanted. So if we went into that entity manager and looked at that X and Y, they got scaled down. Okay, so that should match, and we could pull it up in the body generator and make sure. So that is a square. And we could see what that position was if we wanted to. All right, but what we didn't end up seeing was the player on top of our world. So that's another issue that we need to do, and we need to be in the main game screen. So we updated our world, but our map is actually building our stuff where we are not on the top of it. So we're going to have to deal with that. If I took off the rendering the map, we should be able to see our player, and we should be able to see the entities that were still created. It's just not showing us our map. So let's go ahead and run that. And then that just lets us know that we have to edit how we're generating our map. So I see everything now. I don't see the player. It looks like it's not scaling on the player. But that would be the location. Oops, that's why. That's the other piece. So back in the main game screen, we got to change the map back to this map. Get our player, see if it created the enemy entities and stuff next to it, and then we can deal with those pieces. So a lot of kind of debugging as you're trying to get stuff put together, but once you have a good framework, then you can do a lot of things with it. We can improve upon it. Okay, so there is my entity, that size. Now that's in terms of, look how small that is. But now we are showing that we are interacting. And we can see I just interacted with the enemy. Okay, but it's still showing that I'm interacting with the enemy over and over and over. And I can interact with my level, so I see that. Okay, so we are where we need to be, but all of our players are super tiny compared to all of our other obstacles. So they were getting generated, but we couldn't see them. But there still is an order issue. So we are going to have to resize to the level. But now we know that our player collision is getting generated correctly. So if we look at our tiled, we want the sizes to be the same, but we are pulling this in not from the sizes that are pulled in from there. So in terms of our entity manager, let's go back in there. We are pulling the X and Y, but in our body component, we're setting our dimensions to 1, which we don't want it to be. We want it to be treated as 1, as if the size of that stuff is 1. So that would be in our body generator. We need to go in there. Okay. So dimensions are getting passed in as 1. That is not getting converted down. Okay, let's undo this piece because we're creating it not from tile. Just double check. That's our position that we're I think the box is getting set off the normal size, and our Y is getting set off the normal size. We're getting the X and Y. We don't, it's the numbers that we're looking for that we're needing to convert down, those X's, the X and the Y. The X and the Y, that is our 1, so we want this to be a half and this to be a half. because that's the dimensions that we're passing in. Now, okay. It should give us a different size. Okay. There we go. All right, now the camera is moving, and when we're interacting, now that's the enemy that we just interacted with. That's the coin we just interacted with, but it's not resetting. It's still showing coin or other. Okay. So we want to, that's level, but it's still showing it. Okay. So we actually want this to reset when we do it. So our collision system needs to have that after we dealt with that entity interaction, we need to reset it. So after we get done with dealing with all of our interactions, so whether it's this, the player or the enemy or the other, we need to reset after we finish processing our entity. Okay, so after we finish processing the entity, we are going to go to the collision, that collision component, and we need to set the collision to null. Okay, which would reset it. So let's just double check that that collision component, that's what we're getting for anything that had a collided component. Now, when we run, it will reset it to nothing, and so it shouldn't keep going through there unless there was a collided entity on it. So as long as we had it, we register that it was hit, then we dealt with it, then we can have it removed. So it's not going to do it more than once. All right, so I touch the coin. All right, you see how it's not doing it the entire time. I touch my enemy. If I do it again, it's going to keep registering each time. So let's go and look at that. All right, so we contacted, the player collided with the enemy, we ended the contact. Okay. Contact, player collided with the coin, and it's saying that it collided with something else, and then it was done. Okay, so we only see it showing up once, which is what we want, so then we could start dealing with it. We could have the coin remove itself and all of that stuff. So we had to deal with a couple issues to make sure that the player was getting correctly drawn. Now we can go ahead and we could render the map again. And make sure that green is really making it kind of hard to see, but scale-wise, they should be the right size. We should be able to run with the map now and have them collide with that entity. So the collision system is set up. We did have to scale not the X, or not the dimensions, but the X that we were using for where our player and enemies are getting drawn. In the box generator, so there they are. That's what we wanted. We set up the camera to be able to use the player's position based off of this player component, so we were making sure that we were only getting the player. We have it where we can interact with our different stuff, and it's registering when we've interacted with that level. We can deal with it. We have it where it's registering if we're interacting with the coin or the player itself. Now we just watched the coin go right through the enemy because that's how we set up our mask and category bits. Alrighty? Okay. In future videos, we're going to be building out the collision system so we can start dealing with a coin being collected, and then how I did it in my game, but there are multiple ways that you could do it, where if that coin was collected, we could, increase the player's coin amount, and then remove that coin from the game world. Okay? All right. Have fun.